So I'm going to be looking at what is called the deep tier or deep tier plyometrics. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video of plyometrics and jump training with Matt McInnes-Watson. So I'm going to be looking at what is called the deep tier or deep tier plyometrics. And I put those inverted commas there because they are not straight away plyometric. I have them within my system and they are structured within Plus Plyos with our tiered system, and that's where that phrase comes from. Now, that's not to say that yielded movement has not been used forever within training for dynamic movement. Everyone's been using yielded actions for a long time, but the phrases tier or deep tier does come from Plus Plyos. And it actually then steeps back to my mentor and coach, Eric Little, who actually inherited them from his coach, Zoltan Tenke, in the 70s. Zoltan was a Hungarian coach that came over to Canada and ultimately brought a lot of Russian and Eastern Bloc training to the Western world, and deep yielded jumping actions were within some of the training and systems that he implemented. Now, Eric took this forward and really created what is the structure of the Plus Plyos system. And I've kind of taken it on myself then to continue to push the value of the tiered system. And as in today's video, the deep tier. So what are deep tier landings? They aren't plyometric because number one, you're spending far too long on the ground. Number two, this leads to much less of a response from the tendinous side of force output. So we use much more of a muscular-based action when we are dropping into longer, deeper ranges of motion. That ultimately is why we class it as the deep tier per se. So what are we looking at? Deep tier movements or deep yielded landings are looking at yielding force. What does yielding mean? Yielding is being able to handle force or to control force into any form of range of motion. Now, you are ultimately always yielding a level of movement or a level of force when you land or you are trying to take off. So when there is propulsion involved in what you are doing as a human or as an animal with multiple joints, there will require a form of yield. So you will get a form of flexion around a joint, which is obviously stimulating the tissue in our body, whether it's muscles, tendons, ligaments, and it is then providing that snapback of energy from that tissue to then propel us forward. Now, the degree of yield is obviously determined on what you're trying to execute. So if you're trying to jump for height from a static position, you'll yield to a certain degree. If you're trying to rebound off the ground, like a typical plyometric, you'll yield a little less because you're trying to maintain momentum, and us humans don't like to sink into movement when we're trying to maintain momentum or velocity. So why are deep yielded landings important? So you'll see within sport, there are lots of deeper ranges of movement that you'll get when you're accelerating, decelerating, cutting, changing direction. So I find that adding in the deep tier amongst all of your other plyometrics and jumping modalities is really valuable. Not enough people are using deep yielded actions with a full landing and takeoff based sequence. So that is where this push for deep tier movement is coming from. So how might you use deep tier and how might you scale it up? So the deep tier can be used in the simplest forms, and that's where we add in oscillatory based movements. Oscillatory or oscillation is a small up and down motion to what you are trying to do. So people use this in strength training, but I also use this in the deep tier. So in a deep range of motion, you can oscillate in the bottom there. What this does is it builds confidence in that zone or in that area of range of motion. What you can then do from there is scale that up, increase that size of oscillation, and ultimately you'll get to a place where you're completely extending and flexing in that sequence of movement. And with that, you are then increasing the gravity overload as to the movement that you're doing. So we scale up from those oscillations into a full-blown movement, and then the ultimate scale up is to be doing it 4 and 10. Typical one is like a squat jump pattern, what I class as a deep leap for height, where you're going to be sending it as high as you possibly can which is going to stimulate just how much more eccentric force you're going to receive on the other side. So that's how you will scale up the deep tier. Where do you put the deep tier within your training? I'm finding that one of the biggest areas of training that it is stimulating is for people like Olympic lifters. They are using the deep tier as a way to overload the body without using an external stimulus to do that. They're not having to use a barbell, a med ball, whatever it might be, a plate to jump around with. They can use gravity as that overload, or you can use negative foot speed if you're using a bound or a hop. They're finding a way to flip the mechanism, focus on how velocity creates overload, as opposed to having to overcome the external stimulus that they're working with. Now, if you're using this in lifting, weightlifting, whatever it might be, if you're just training in the gym, you can use, let's say, a bilateral pattern to prepare you for feeling more comfortable with, let's say, a back squat. You could be using this in the warm-up, you could be using this within the session, you could be using it interchangeably with a superset, and ultimately this is a great way to get overload into the system in a deeper range. Now, where else might you use the deep tier? I use the deep tier all the time at the end of a larger plyometric session. So if you have done the plyometrics of Plus Plyos, if you're using a light, medium, ping, and then you'll finish up with deep tier. So we've got those three more stiffer overcoming forms of plyometrics, and then we finish the session up with what is not a plyometric, but it still has that landing and takeoff based element. But you're really flipping the focus of things. Instead of trying to overcome the force, you're now using that force. So you're kind of going with that force into deeper ranges. It becomes great sensationally on how you feel to finish up that session. And you're also getting in a ton of great stability work at those deeper ranges. And the control of someone's posture when they're taken into those deep ranges with the overload there is fantastic for how that is going to support those things that we spoke about earlier: change of direction, acceleration, deceleration. And I think that gives you a great general base as to how you can then continually push through those performance ceilings. A lot of people get stuck with trying to go for the hard, stiff stuff all the time, but ultimately it could be that you need deeper ranges of motion or deep tier movements, almost said plyometrics, but you're looking at using the deep tier movements to break down those inhibitions that someone might have. And that then transfers into facilitating what happens when you're trying to send it with stiffer based movements. So that's why I use the deep tier. It's really effective at breaking down those inhibitions. I sprinkle it in after the stiff stuff. I can use it in the warm up as well to help with general lifting based work. And I love it day to day. Just getting into some deeper ranges of motion, bouncing in those movements, using the oscillatory based versions as well. It's fantastic sensationally. That's why you've got to go away and start playing with this stuff. So let me know in the comments below as to whether you're using deep tier movements. I'd love to see more people using this training method. I hope you liked it, guys. Make sure that you do like, subscribe, and comment below. Tune in for another video.